Did you know that Blue Beetle was created just 1 year after Superman was created? He's one of the most underrated comic book characters ever, and while he might not be as known as icons like Batman or Superman, his history is just as deep as those characters, since he was created in 1939, just 1 year after Superman's debut in 1938, and Blue Beetle didn't take long in getting adapted outside the comics, since in 1940, he even had a radio serial following the first incarnation of the character. Despite his initial success and popularity, he eventually fell into obscurity, since even though he is a veteran in comic book history, he didn't appear in a movie or a TV show almost 7 decades after he was created. So in this video, I thought it'd be a fun idea to explore his cinematic and TV history. If you want to hear me talk about a specific show or movie that Blue Beetle appeared in, like Young Justice or his live-action movie for example, you can just check the description or timeline and skip ahead to that part of the video, because I'm gonna go over every single film and television appearance of Blue Beetle in chronological order and talk about each adaptation of the character. So let's get started. The very first appearance of Blue Beetle in TV happened in 2008 when he debuted in the fantastic animated series Batman the Brave and the Bold, a team-up show where Batman appeared with different superheroes in each episode. All 3 versions of Blue Beetle appeared throughout the show, but not only that, the Jaime Reyes version of the character, voiced by Will Friedle, was the very first guest character that Batman teamed up with in the entire series, given that he appeared on the very first episode of the show. And I think that was very fitting, since Jaime Reyes always felt like a character that DC purposefully created in order to actively push him as a recognizable cross-media character like their more popular superheroes. Ever since he debuted in 2006 during the comic book event Infinite Crisis, and right after the event, he was given a solo comic book series written by Keith Giffen and John Rogers and illustrated by Cully Hamner. And only 2 years later, he was already appearing in an animated series as a prominent and recurring character. The show did a great job in portraying the Blue Beetles. Jaime Reyes served as a point-of-view character of sorts whenever he appeared, because he's one of the youngest and most inexperienced characters on the show, so he's supposed to be a more relatable character that young audiences can identify with and see themselves in. It also works because they portrayed Jaime as a huge fanboy of all superheroes, but he's also a huge Batman fan in particular, much like the viewers of the show. And since he was the very first guest character of the series, he served a great role in introducing the over-the-top, larger-than-life greatness of this version of Batman to the audience, since the first time we met the Batman of this series was also the first time that Jaime met him, and we were introduced to Batman through Jaime's eyes. So it was a very smart way of establishing this Batman as being a legendary, larger-than-life figure. And it was a smart way of using Jaime Reyes. Also, the first Blue Beetle, Dan Garrett, also briefly appeared, and the second Blue Beetle, Ted Kord, was a guest character in the episode Menace of the Madniks, which focused on his death and his iconic bromance with Booster Gold, and I'm really happy they adapted this relationship because it's one of the best aspects of both characters. I would name each episode the Blue Beetles appeared in individually, but Jaime was honestly one of the most prominent characters in the show besides Batman. They covered a lot of stuff, from his backstory with the Reach to his time with Justice League International. Overall, all of Blue Beetle's appearances on the show were great, and I think the character owes a lot of his current fans and popularity to the show, since it was the first time that a lot of people were introduced to the concept of Blue Beetle in the first place. I know that because this show was the first time that I personally found out about Blue Beetle when I was a kid, and I'm sure I'm not alone on that one. It was for sure a great introduction to the character and his mythos. Did you know that a solo Blue Beetle project has been in the works over at DC and Warner Brothers for over 10 years? The earliest confirmation of a Blue Beetle project being in the works was back in 2010, when multiple news outlets reported that a Blue Beetle TV series had been teased after Jeff Johns had tweeted that they had recently done a live-action test of Jaime Reyes activating the Scarab and transforming into the Blue Beetle, and that DC Entertainment was hoping that it would lead to a live-action series. A few months after this tweet, DC revealed in Comic-Con 2010 the live-action test footage that Geoff Johns was talking about, featuring stuntman and actor Garrett Plotkin as Jaime Reyes, transforming into Blue Beetle, and this technically counts as the first time we ever got to see Blue Beetle in live action. Clips of this test footage were used for the promotional trailer of Cartoon Network's DC Nation programming block, but this was unfortunately the last thing that we ever saw or heard about the show, and we can assume that it was cancelled for undisclosed reasons. Our next entry is technically Blue Beetle's first appearance in a movie. Well, it is and it isn't, since in 2010, DC released the direct-to-video animated movie Justice League Crisis on Two Earths, which featured a crime syndicate, an evil Justice League from an alternate reality where all of the usual DC heroes have evil counterparts. Most of the popular members had prominent counterparts in the movie, but there were a lot of underrated characters that only had cameos. One such character was an evil orange version of Blue Beetle who briefly appeared in one background scene. Another cool fact is that in The Brave and the Bold, we also got to see the evil Blue Beetle of their version of the crime syndicate, who was colored red and called the Scarlet Scarab. Following this, we have the first official live-action depiction of Blue Beetle, since he appeared in the Smallville Season 10 episode Booster, which featured Booster Gold having been hired by Ted Kord in order to retrieve the Scarab, which had bonded to a teenager in high school named Jaime Reyes. Even though the special effects definitely look outdated by today's standards, and even back then, I think that the Comic-Con test footage for a potential series looked a little better than what they did on Smallville, but I still don't think that it looks bad. They did a great job with what they had at the time, and I do commend them for making an actual practical suit. And I do like the actor's portrayal as Jaime and how they chose to focus on the lack of control that Jaime has over the Scarab at that point of his life. This also wouldn't be the first time that the CW network would try to adapt the Blue Beetle in some way, since later on in 2012, they would start airing Arrow, which began a whole line of DC shows, and early on, there were plans to adapt Ted Kord into their universe. There were multiple Kord industry Easter eggs throughout the first couple seasons of Arrow, and in season 3, they casted Brandon Routh, the actor who played Superman in Superman Returns, as a DC hero that originally was going to be Ted Kord, but he ended up being casted as Ray Palmer, the Atom, instead, since Warner Brothers allegedly didn't give the show's producers permission to use Ted Kord and Blue Beetle, since they had other plans for the character in live action, which might have been referencing the cancelled TV show that Geoff Johns was trying to get off the ground around the same time. Jaime Reyes was a crucial character in the second season of Young Justice, subtitled Invasion, which focused on the team of young heroes having to fight against an alien invasion that involved the Reach, the species that originally created the Scarab, and in turn are responsible for Blue Beetle existing in the first place. This season did a great job in their depiction of Jaime, who was portrayed by Eric Lopez. This characterization was great, and it was easy to relate to a kid that was bonded to something that gave him amazing potential, but that he couldn't control. The concept of not being able to control your own body as an alien weapon takes command over you and starts attacking people and your friends as you can do nothing to stop it is a cool and interesting concept from the character's mythos that the show portrayed really well, and the relationship between Jaime and Impulse was also really great. Another important thing is that both Dan Garrett and Ted Kord appeared on the show, and overall they did a great job in faithfully adapting their backstories and what makes these characters so interesting in the first place. I imagine that as with The Brave and the Bold, a lot of you were probably introduced to Blue Beetle through Young Justice, and if you haven't seen it yet, I highly suggest that you check out the series, and especially this season if you want to get into Blue Beetle. Around 2015, a lot of online news outlets started reporting that Warner Brothers was interested in making a buddy cop style movie starring Booster Gold and Blue Beetle, with Greg Berlanti directing and Zach Penn serving as the screenwriter. No further news ever really came after this, and there never was any official announcement, but I also wanted to mention it in the video just to show how much Blue Beetle has been considered in many different DC movies and TV projects. And as we can see, usually whenever Blue Beetle is set to appear, Booster Gold is also very likely to show up as well. He's another character with some cancelled projects of his own. Back in the early 2010s, it was reported that the Sci-Fi Channel had ordered a script for a potential show based on Booster Gold, with involvement by once again Greg Berlanti, which never happened in the end, but Booster Gold did eventually appear in a live-action series once again in the final episode of Legends of Tomorrow, where he was portrayed by Donald Faison. Moving on from that Blue Beetle cancelled project, his next official appearance in a DC series would be in 2016's Justice League Action, where he was voiced by Jake T. Austin. He appeared in the episode Timeshare, where he fought against Kronos alongside Batman, who is testing him in order to officially enter the Justice League, and he later appeared in another episode where he teamed up with Firestorm and Stargirl. Overall, Justice League Action is a very underrated show. I've always liked how charming it is, the characterizations are all pretty great, the voice cast is awesome, and it's just a very fun show that focuses on smaller scale adventures within the DCU. And I also find it really cool that Blue Beetle finally appeared on a Justice League cartoon, since he never officially appeared in the DCAU back in the early 2000s, with Ted Kord only appearing on some Justice League Unlimited tie-in comics. Also in 2016, Blue Beetle appeared in the direct-to-video animated movie Justice League vs. Teen Titans, where he was once again played by Jake T. Austin. It focused on the Justice League getting mind-controlled by Trigon, who's Raven's father, and also gets the Teen Titans involved. Jaime Reyes is a member of Teen Titans in this universe, and honestly, I like this iteration of him. Besides that haircut, he was portrayed with a slightly more serious personality than how he was shown on Young Justice, but it works in the movie. And he had an interesting rivalry with Damian Wayne throughout the movie. The following year, a sequel would come out, titled Teen Titans: The Judas Contract, an adaptation of the classic comic book storyline of the same name by George Perez and Marv Wolfman. Of course, Jaime would appear once again in the Titans lineup, and I find it really cool that this time they focused on Jaime's close relationship with his family, how important they are to him, and the conflict he feels being so distant from them because of his powers and the Scarab. They showed Jaime's humanitarian and empathetic side, and it really added to his character. This is actually a very good movie that I highly recommend you check out if you haven't seen it before. The animation is great and fluid, with some fantastic action scenes. Each character gets development, and it tastefully adapted the source material, even the more sensitive aspects of it. The New 52-inspired DC animated movies can vary widely in quality, and some were honestly pretty bad, but they did get better in quality as they progressed, and The Judas Contract is definitely one of the better movies from that era. There also reportedly was almost a third Teen Titans animated movie we never got to see, which I briefly talked about in another video where I go through every single cancelled DC animated movie. So it's safe to assume that if the movie ended up being made, they also would have included Blue Beetle once again. Ted Kord had a speechless cameo and briefly appears in a few scenes from Teen Titans Go to the Movies, the big screen feature film of Teen Titans Go. And honestly, the movie is actually pretty good, and sure, it does have some obnoxious humor like the show, and some obnoxious songs, but some of the jokes also land at times. It also experiments with different animation styles and keeps things varied throughout the movie, so I do kinda recommend this one, especially if you have children or a younger sibling, of course. The next year, in 2019, Ted Kord would make another appearance, this time in the second season of DC Superhero Girls, where he was voiced by Max Middleman, and he seemingly had a crush on Supergirl. The final appearance of the Jaime Reyes version from the DC animated movies would come in Justice League Dark Apokolips War, where him and most of the Teen Titans ended up being killed by parademons. In 2021, DC released an awesome animated short focused on the Ted Kord version of Blue Beetle, and it took stylistic inspiration from the 60s Spider-Man cartoon, with it being animated very similarly, having cheesy dialogue and with it being so beautifully campy.
Blue Beetle, Blue Beetle, Blue Beetle, when you need some help, he'll save the day.
It's awesome, and by paying homage to Spider-Man in a Ted Kord cartoon, it's also making reference to Steve Ditko and his multiple works, since Ditko co-created both Spider-Man and also Ted Kord when he worked for Charlton Comics in the 1960s and reinvented the Blue Beetle concept, and the short pays great homage and respect to Charlton Comics and the Silver Age in general, with Captain Atom and also the Question appearing in the short as well. It's just a really awesome piece of animation, and I can't recommend it enough. Keeping up with Ted Kord appearances, he also showed up in the animated crossover movie Teen Titans Go and DC Superhero Girls Mayhem in the Multiverse, with Max Middleman voicing him once again. Before I talk about what is to this day the latest adaptation of Blue Beetle outside the comics, I also wanted to do a couple honorable mentions that are relevant to Blue Beetle's TV and cinematic history. Back in the 1970s, a character that was called the Blue Beetle appeared on the educational TV show The Electric Company. He was played by actor Jim Boyd, and he really doesn't resemble comic book Blue Beetle at all. He wasn't really based on the comic book character, and instead, he's just a parody of sorts, who only shares the name. But I still thought it was worth mentioning because we got to see Blue Beetle with Spider-Man. Look at that. Another cool fact that some of you might not know is that Blue Beetle almost appeared in the classic comic book Watchmen. And that's because the writer, Alan Moore, originally planned to use the characters from Charlton Comics for the story, since DC had acquired their legal rights fairly recently at the time. However, editor Dick Giordano didn't give him permission to use the characters, making him create original characters for the story instead. That's how characters like the Question became Rorschach, Captain Atom became Dr. Manhattan, and Blue Beetle ended up becoming Night Owl. So whenever you're watching Zack Snyder's Watchmen and see Night Owl and his ship, that technically almost was Blue Beetle and the Bug. Finally, we have the latest adaptation of Blue Beetle outside the comics, and it's a special one, because this is his very first solo live-action movie, after a decade of DC actively trying to develop a project solely focused on him. They finally announced a Blue Beetle movie back in 2018, and it was originally going to release directly on HBO Max, with Ángel Manuel Soto being announced as director and Xolo Maridueña being announced as Jaime Reyes. However, after the merger between Warner Brothers and Discovery happened, and David Zaslav became the new CEO of the company, they decided to release the movie theatrically instead. After years of waiting for a solo Blue Beetle project, I can fortunately say that the movie didn't disappoint. In my opinion, it's a very good movie, and honestly, the best movie that DC released in 2023. The movie has great performances, with very good chemistry between its actors that convincingly portray a family that's very close to each other. They really managed to successfully adapt the theme of family in the movie without it feeling obnoxious or inauthentic. Everyone's performances managed to be very charismatic and also very emotional when the story calls for it. The movie's pacing is great. I also loved its art direction, the synth music, the 80s vibe, and the neon look for the original Palmera City gives it a unique feeling that adds personality and character to the movie and helps in setting Blue Beetle apart from other superhero films. I also have to acknowledge and appreciate the great job this movie did with its Latino representation. As a Latino myself, I really appreciated the attention to detail. Little touches like references to classic TV shows like El Chapulín Colorado, mannerisms and customs like how casually religious the characters are, such as Jaime, for example, saying the El Padre Nuestro prayer when he thinks he's about to die, or stuff like each character listening to different types of music genres goes a long way in making the audience feel more attached to these characters, and this much attention to detail just goes to show how much thought and care went into this film. I also liked how this movie touched on the reality of growing up as an illegal immigrant in the US. I really felt identified with the character's struggles, and I'm not even Mexican. I'm actually Uruguayan, you know, from Uruguay. It's cool if you don't know what's Uruguay or where it even is. It's there, by the way. There's a country there. I swear to God, it exists. Even though I can relate to its story because I'm also a Latino that lived the immigrant experience in the US, I still want to clarify you don't have to be from an immigrant or a Latino background to enjoy this movie. The film also has other relatable aspects. If you grew up poor, for example, or with a family that financially struggled, you will probably also relate to this movie. If you have college debt from student loans, you'll also probably relate to this movie. Of course, a movie doesn't have to be relatable in order for it to be good. There's plenty of movies that have unrelatable characters that are still absolutely great, but cultural details like these are still something that can definitely add to a movie and make it feel more realized and well thought out. And here I briefly wanted to talk about some spoilers because there's a couple things that I really want to talk about, so skip to this part of the video if you haven't seen it yet. Another great thing that this movie did was how they handled the death of Jaime's father. All of that attention to detail and focus on family that this movie did early on really paid off, since they made the audience get attached to these characters first, so by the time the plot got to the tragic Uncle Ben moment, we were actually emotionally invested, making the entire scene all the more impactful and effective. I also really liked Carapax as a villain. It's amazing how they humanized him by setting his backstory in the context of the US intervention in Guatemala back in the 1980s, and how the US-backed government of Guatemala at the time were responsible for the horrific Dos Eres massacre of 1982, where the Guatemalan government bombarded the indigenous village of Las Dos Eres, killing at least 160 people. We can even get to hear Carapax speaking in his native indigenous language when he confronts Victoria Court, and I really appreciated how they also used the School of the Americas in his backstory as well, which, for those of you who don't know, was an institution founded by the American government in Panama back in 1946 to have a larger presence in the continent and train the militaries of the area, which later went on to commit atrocities throughout Latin America, with help from what they learned from the US and also their backing. For example, dictator Manuel Noriega was formed in the School of the Americas. It's a little known fact of US interventionism that impacted all of Latin America, including my own country, where we also went through a military dictatorship at the time. So I really appreciate the fact that this movie acknowledged this dark but important part of history. I also liked how they merged the character of Carapax with Omac, since by having Omac in the film, it's also making reference to the fact that in the comics, Ted Cord died investigating Omac, Brother Eye, and Maxwell Lord, and he also liked that Victoria Cord is kind of an adaptation of Jarvis Cord, Ted's evil uncle from the comics, since she's also an evil family member trying to use the scarab. There's just a lot of reasons to like this movie, and of course it's not perfect. No movie is. There are some issues, like the humor being very hit or miss at times. The movie is also really predictable. The script does execute really well the usual superhero tropes, but since it's still an origin story, it can be somewhat cliché and formulaic. The action scenes can also feel a little lackluster. Some are great, like in the climax, but sometimes it felt like an episode of Power Rangers or Kamen Rider with a larger budget. And even though I do commend the movie for tackling issues like racism, sexism, gentrification, US interventionism, and so on, it also feels like they could have delved deeper into the subjects. I do understand that overall they wanted the movie to have a lighter tone, but they still could have handled these sensitive topics less superficially. And yet, even with its shortcomings, it's still a very good movie in my opinion. So there you go. That was the entire history of Blue Beetle in movies and TV so far. we don't really know where the character will appear next, but we do know that DC announced a Booster Gold TV show that'll come out sometime in the future. So it's very likely that we might see either Jaime or Ted on the show, hopefully both. And Jaime could also appear in Peacemaker Season 2, since they do share a history in the comics. So who knows? Other than that, it's anyone's guess as to where we might get to see Blue Beetle in the DCU next time. But I think that Blue Beetle has managed to become a fairly well recognized character from DC and has grown a lot in popularity in the past decade, so I'm sure we'll get to see more of Blue Beetle. But I want to know from you guys, what do you like the most about Blue Beetle? If you've seen it already, what do you think about the movie? Do you think that Blue Beetle is able to carry his own animated show or live action series? Please let me know what you think in the comments, and as always, thank you so much for watching.